Hey everybody. Hope that everyone's doing well, and it's hard to believe that I've probably said this already a few times, and I probably made a few warnings about it right at the start of our class. Is that it's hard to believe that we're coming up on the last day. Um, this is the sort of second video that I'm making in relation to the class, and it's sort of long awaited. Not just, I know I was hoping to get it done at the end of last week or the start of this week, and we're all the way at the end of this week, and I'm finally getting to it. Part of the reason why is because there's so much. One of the challenges, the real difficulties here is that there's so many ideas, and that's a great thing. But putting them together, sort of collecting them and refracting them off of each other, right, can be a lot. And I think another reason that I was hesitant or delayed a little bit in doing this video is I initially started off the first video thinking I was going to do like a 10-minute, 15-minute spiel, if you will, and it turned into a whole hour-long thing. So then it sort of created this new circumstance of pressure, like I got to create another hour-long effort. Of course, it's inevitable that I create hour-long videos with how verbose I am. So I want to start and get right to what I want to deal with. And this is going to be both sort of primarily in relation to Module 2's sort of overall thematic concept of new media networks. And what does that mean? Our first module is about the individual, or this notion of the myth of genius, death of the individual. In some ways, I'm going to be kind of snapping back on that, but perhaps in a different way, right? Right. The first module wasn't necessarily about just destroying the notion of the individual. If anything, individuality and points of view, perspective, and this is something that our class visitor Stephanie talked about, right? Having that point of view. And Dom and Max talked about this too. In a collaboration team, everybody's got their own perspective. But thinking about individuality in a way that isn't so beholden to a notion of originality, or that isn't so beholden to an idea of genius, and that allows us to get away from this idea that that great ideas or that great productions or that creativity is something that is a solitary activity, even if we are doing it alone. In many ways, you guys are working alone on your projects. At the same time, though, you have the context of our class, you have the context of your paired partner, you have the context, right, of the online activities we've been doing, of the class visitors, of the reading material we've been doing, for better or for worse, right? So those things all produce a different concept, I would argue, of individuality. So the new media networks, really, the focus, the shift in focus here is towards thinking about our current context of our society and how that creates a different kind of individual or a different kind of self, or I would say creates a different kind of demand, or presents us with different kinds of demands or challenges. So thinking about context in a couple ways. Context as the who, what, when, where, how, and I guess eventually the why, but the who, what, when, where of our current age, right? The digital era, whatever you want to call it, the new media era, the era of social media. What does that mean? But also the personal context, right? Your personal context that's connected to where you grew up. It's connected to your culture, your ethnicity, your race, your religion, your spirituality, whatever it might, your class, your job, whatever it might be. All those sort of variables that make up our sense of identity. Those things are very contextual, right? So individual context being another kind of context, and the third thing in terms of context sort of is thinking about the way those two things combine, and what does that mean? How does that create a different idea of individuality, and how does that shape and influence how we work, how we produce, how we create. So I want to address that. And I'm going to start to try and entice you into this. I think I said at one of the first classes that I was going to be a little more personal than I normally am, perhaps in my teaching, partially because it's a summer class, partially because it's about talking about creativity as process, but also partially because it's a small group, and many of you are sharing things in relation to your own projects within the exchanges and the project journals that are quite personal. And in order for me to help you think about, or hope to help, actually to contribute to the entire group thinking about the ways in which we can be more creative, more productive, and thinking about collaboration, right? Part of that, I think, is talking about my experiences with that. So I have a confession right from the get-out. As a young man, as an undergrad, actually, and even before that, I really didn't care about history at all. And I mean, I don't think that's very shocking. I don't think I know there are people who are young and love history and read history and study history and major in history and do all those things. But for my part, I was very not interested in history. And I would like to think it had something to do with sort of my interest in artwork. And I'm getting at this as a confession because I felt this was sort of foolish on my part. Right? I mean, my big obsession with art was the way that, a couple things, was the sort of affective practice that Papacharissi, the article that we read, talks about, right? That artists are often engaging in storytelling and creation in such a way that is affective, meaning it's related to the emotions, it's related to experience, it's related to subjectivity, it's related to sensuality. Right, and I was fascinated by those artists who were very progressive, who were the avant-garde. In fact, I went on in my PhD to study primarily avant-garde art. And one of the sort of premises of avant-garde art, and we're talking in the turn of the 20th century, right? So in the late 1900s on into the 20th century, into the late 1800s, turning into the 1900s, right, the start of the 20th century. One of the sort of concepts of the avant-garde movement, and this is going on up into World War II, was to make it new, right, to constantly do things differently. So in some ways, for whatever reason, I felt that history was a burden, right, that you're sort of it would drag you down, right? You would imitate. You would just merely be imitating the masters. That if you're really going to find something new, that if you're really going to be avant-garde, you had to sort of, wake up every day with not knowing anything, with a completely clean slate. So the best you could do is not know any of the artwork that had come before you. Of course, this is impossible. This is a kind of idealistic. And I would like to actually argue, then this is another part of the confession, is a very sort of idealistic and privileged viewpoint. And it takes me to a really important quote, and I've attached another sheet of quotes for you that I'll be referring to, and I want to talk about the first one, which is from George Santayana, who says, "Those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it." And that is a point that really sort of hit me upside the head. I mean, eventually, as an artist, it was inevitable that I'd be studying what artists came before me, whether it was in the visual arts, whether it was in literature, whether it was in what have you. And now I have a sort of obsession with history. I mean, even sort of notions of microhistory, and I mean, history not just of art, but history of the world, and history of different cultures, and of food, and of conflict and politics, and history of it excites me in so many different ways now. But what I was talking about in relation to what Santayana is talking about, he says, you're right, those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it, is that this connects to privilege for me, is that as a white male, much of the sort of cultural history and much of the history that we have learned in schools is very white privileged. Right. So as a white male myself, that history didn't really challenge me or complicate me, so in other words, by resisting history is a very sort of, I would say, white privileged thing to do in particular. Right. I mean, if I really start to study more transgressive, progressive, and critical history, right, like Howard Zinn, or some of the history that is from of cultures that have been oppressed in our society, right, that would really start to shake me up in some sense as a white individual, in the sense that I do have deep concerns and have deep and disturbed by the history of oppression that continues in this country and that has happened before. But my point being then is that context is crucial, which means knowing my history. And by knowing my history, I can therefore know what it means to be alive now, right? And that seems crucial, right? And no matter what race, ethnicity, gender, what have you, but perhaps particularly for those races and genders who have been considered the majority or dominant, or who have stolen history, or who have written history for themselves in a way that often excludes and maintains certain privileges and ideals that should be challenged. I mean, obviously, I'm skirting the surface of these ideas here, but this is where I think context becomes really important. And this is why I asked you to think about that notion of the hero share, right? And this is also where I ask you to consider the context of your interests, right? Like, Chase, if you're interested in film and you're also interested in law, it's good to know the history of those things. Likewise, Rachel being interested in sort of speech therapy, or forgive me if I get this wrong, or family studies, or psychology, or even Mike and Kristen, and being interested in literature. It's good to know the history of those things. What's happening with literature right now? What is happening with psychology right now? What is happening with film right now? What is happening with law right now? How are those things changing, and how are those things changed in the past, right? Knowing your context seems absolutely crucial. And that's going to be sort of the overarching thesis of what I'm going to talk about for the rest of this video, is that having that sense of context, I think, is absolutely crucial if we're talking about creativity, and if we're talking about productivity, and if we're talking about, and this is something that, a quote that Chase, I believe you brought in. It's the third quote on the sheet. I'm jumping over a quote, but right, Chase posted in the Keyword Archive by Einstein: try not to become a man of success, but rather try to become a man of value, which instantly raises the question of what is it meant to become a man or a woman of value? What is a person, a human of value? What does that mean? And what does that mean within the current context within which we live, the sort of new media context, the digital context, the digital world? So part of thinking about that is understanding, something that Karl Marx pointed out in the Communist Manifesto, right? Karl Marx wrote, and Frederick Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto back at the end, in this case, of the 19th century, or mid-19th century, right? And they were writing at a time when the context of society was changing dramatically, and this is a massive simplification, but we only have, I want to keep this to an hour. They're writing at a time when we're going from a highly agrarian, particularly in England and Germany and Europe, Western Europe, going from an agrarian society, right, into a sort of capitalistic society, meaning going from a society that's based upon farming, where you owned your own land, where you owned your own crops, you really had a much more intimate, if you will, connection to land, to a sort of machinic society, where you're talking about mass production of goods, right? Where you're going and working at somebody else's business, you're running a machine to create things for you. And this has changed now too, right? We live in a kind of digital economy that's more of like a service-based economy. That's a different relationship and conception of machines, and computers are obviously very different machines. But Marx's point was this, right, is that, and this is the second quote on the sheet, that each country has its own ruling class. In capitalist countries, the rulers own the means of production and employ workers. Right? Means of production are what it takes to produce goods. Right? It's really simplifying it. Raw materials, satellite networks, machinery, ships, and factories are examples of goods. Workers own nothing but their ability to sell their labor for a wage. Right? So what Marx is concerned about is the way in which subjectivity and humanity is being changed. Right? And so if we transfer that quote to today, and this is thinking about context, we transfer that quote to today, and we're thinking about one of the primary means of production, if you will, is media, right? So digital media, again, living in this era of new media networks, this era of digitization, mass digitization. Right, and we have these huge media conglomerates, right, that own corporations that own the media, right. So whether we're talking Disney or Viacom or AOL, Time Warner, whatever there might be, right, they are the new they are the high capitalists of our society, right. Not to mention things like Apple, right, who building the machinery, building the machines that in many cases produce, if you will, or mediate how we express ourselves, right? How we are. And that doesn't mean it's always oppressive. It just means that it's important to think about the ways in which we are produced as people, if that makes sense. So let me give you an example. Right. We sort of looked at one example when we looked at Sir Kenneth Robinson's discussion of education and how the way we structure education, populate education, all the hows, the way we teach, the way we learn, the way we go to school, the way we, all those things affect who we are, what we are, how we think, how we relate to one another. Right. And this is something I read an interesting article by actually a former teacher of mine, Viet Thanh Nguyen, who it was in the New York Review of Books. Forgive me, I didn't have time to put the whole quote on there, but I talked about this notion of white privilege at the start, right? And this is something, for example, that he's addressing in this article. It's called "Your Writing Tools Aren't Mine." And what he's talking about is how in writing workshops, I spent a lot of my life in creative writing workshops. That was my major. Spent my entire life in universities. Right? So I like to think about how that production facility, if you will, that has been so responsible for shaping not only my knowledge and my work, but also my sense of self, my sense of value and importance, my ideals, all those things, right? One of the credos of those creative writing workshops, and maybe those of you who have been in them before, is show, don't tell. And Viet's, don't just tell us the story, show it, right? Make it active, make it alive, make it vital, right? And Viet writes how this is problematic. This is a very white male way of thinking about writing. And so this is to quote him: as an institution, the workshop reproduces its ideology, which pretends that show, don't tell is universal, when it is, in fact, the expression of a particular population, the white majority, typically at least middle class and often but not exclusively male. The identity behind the workshop's origins is invisible. Like all privileges, here's that word privilege, this identity, is unmarked until it is thrown into relief against that which is marked, visible, and outspoken, which is to say, me and others like me. And then he goes into this wonderful sort of, and I'm just going to take a moment to read this because I think it's wonderful, and you should look. It's called "Your Writing Tools Aren't Mine" by Viet Nguyen. We, the barbarians at the gate, the descendants of Caliban, right? Caliban being the character from The Tempest, who was the character who was the sort of beastly other, right? The character of color, right? In many ways, right? And Viet himself is a refugee from Vietnam during the Vietnam War, his parents. The ones who have no choice but to speak in the language we have, we come bearing the experiences and ideas the workshop suppresses, right? We come from the communist countries America bombed during the Cold War, or where it sponsored counter-communist efforts. We come from the lands America occupied, invaded, or colonized. We come as refugees and immigrants, documented and undocumented. We come from the ghettos, barrios, reservations, and borders of America where there are no workshops. We come from the bedrooms and the kitchens of the American home where we were supposed to stay and stay silent. We come speaking languages other than English. We come from the margins where English is broken. We come with financial aid and loans and families that do not understand what creative writing is. We come from communities we do not wish to renounce in the name of our individualism. We come wanting to do more than just sell our stories to wide audiences. And we come with desire not just to show, but to tell. So what Viet is doing there, I mean, I think it's a wonderful article and insight. There's actually a letter in the book review a couple of weeks later that responds to this in interesting ways. But again, we don't have time to get into that. What Viet, I think, is doing is he's cracking open the historical context of the workshop as the way in which it's been very privileged and it's been very determinative, and the ways in which it oppresses, and the way it controls, and the way it produces a certain ideal of what writing should be. So if I'm thinking about creativity and I'm thinking about individualism and identity and collaboration and context, right? Knowing those things is going to be very useful to think about how I can actually express a kind of individualism, or develop a kind of effective practice that is much more activated and activist, and is much more, effective, and gets at a deeper kind of truth, which I'll address at the end of this, right? So that, for me, a person who understands that and works in that direction is the closest I can come to maybe answering what Einstein means by a man of value, right? Einstein dramatically changed the way we think about, and I know little about theory of relativity and all those things. That's definitely not my field. But I do know that what Einstein did was basically turn the world upside down, and the way we think about physics. It was completely, it was as if, like I said, he turned the world upside down. Completely changed the way we thought about those things, and it completely changed the way we think about humanity and the world and our relationship to it and our role within it. That, to me, is to become someone of value. So the challenge, of course, and this is part two, that part one was about privilege as history without context. Right, that privilege is history without context. Part two is where are we now? And I called it the networks of nowhere. I want to say the 16th century. I should have looked up the date. Samuel Butler wrote a book called Erewhon, which is essentially nowhere spelled backwards, and it was a kind of social critique, And his concern was, again, sort of like Marx, but well before that, right? I should really look up the date, but I might be way off with the 16th century. But he was concerned with the way machines were. One of the things he writes about at great length is sort of machines. And Deleuze and Guattari, who are philosophers, theorists, contemporary philosophers and theorists, wrote in their book Anti-Oedipus in 1972 that, quote, and this is the fourth quote on the sheet, for one thing, Butler, meaning Samuel Butler, who wrote this book, Erewhon, Nowhere, is not content to say that machines extend the organism, that they make us better. Right? It's one of the ways we talk about our machines, and if you think about them, the way we use them and relate to them is often this idea they make us better. I always have my phone in my hand. That means I know, it's an extension of my being. We have that sense of it not only in terms of our own experience, right? You lose your phone, you feel like you lose your life. Right? I mean, I'm being dramatic, of course, but you know that feeling. Like, I don't have my phone, I might feel, if I'm somebody who regularly has my phone on me and I don't have it all of a sudden, I might feel lost. I might feel like I've lost a part of me, right? But Butler is not content with that, is what Deleuze and Guattari are saying. I'm sure I'm butchering their names, and I apologize for that. Rather, quote, but he asserts that they are really limbs and organs lying on the body without organs of a society. So there are these strange things that are kind of laid over the top of us. Not perfectly functional, right? Deleuze and Guattari are known for their kind of abstract and sort of dramatic and intense metaphors, right? So he says that what these machines will do, men will appropriate according to their power and their wealth. And this goes right back to the Marx quote, that technology in many ways is going to be used by the wealthy to exploit, because they own the means of production most often, is going to be used to exploit people to their advantage, right? So the wealthy to their advantage. So to finish the quote, men will appropriate according to their power and their wealth, and whose poverty deprives them as if they were mutilated organisms, right? So this notion of exploitation is a kind of mutilating power, right? And I would argue that not understanding this about context and about the means of production are ways in which we can be oppressed, mutilated, which is a very graphic description, but an interesting one. I think it's purposefully really stark and really graphic in order to sort of grab our attention, right? And this gets at the next quote, right, which is bringing us to, like I said, the context of today. In many ways, there's a lot of optimism and kind of new horizon thinking with the dawn of the internet, right? And this is what Klint Finley is talking about in an article called "The Internet Democracy is Great in Theory." Right? The idea is that, the internet is supposedly was going to be a free, universally accessible, democratic space where you can put anything, everybody can put anything and everything up. Of course, that's not the way it is now. And it's becoming more and more regulated. It's becoming more and more expensive. The technology in many ways is keeping the wealth, in order to have a sort of high-powered internet connection, it isn't very cheap to do that, right? We might feel like in a first world country, like, well, it's not that expensive. But, if I'm living in a third world country, a lot of people in third world countries don't have access to the internet and are isolated from the internet, or they have situations in which the internet is bound or restricted. But at the dawn of the internet, right, it was considered, we might finally have a democratic society, or a full democracy, if you will. So Finley writes, quote, "The promise of digital democracy goes something like this. In the early days of the U.S., few people could travel to the Capitol to voice their opinions on the issues of the day. Mail took weeks to deliver. But in the digital age, communications travel nearly instantly, removing or at least dramatically lowering the barriers to participation. Want to debate just about anyone on any issue from just about anywhere? Welcome to Twitter." So suddenly, in theory, hence Finley's title, everybody now has a voice, no matter where they are. So it doesn't matter if you're living in the outskirts of Oklahoma, right? You can be in the heart of Paris via the internet, in theory, right? And this is where a notion of space and location becomes important. If I think about the word context, right, a big part of that word is space or place. Let me say the place is probably a better word, location. Where am I within this context, within this society, thinking about those things, right? And this is something that the Papacharissi article argues, is that in some ways what the internet does is the fact that it gives us supposed access to all these spaces from just about anywhere, as Finley says. I can be anywhere, and have the internet give me access to anywhere. That means there's a loss of a somewhere, right? In other words, that we're always sort of alienated. We're always in this kind of virtual relationship to one another, right? So you hear people talk a lot about, right, well, I don't like go and meet people, people chatting on the internet instead of meeting in person, or developing relationships virtually rather than actually sitting down face to face, or, people never talking to their neighbors because, it's just much easier to be, on our computer or phone or just watch the television, right? So this notion of dislocation. And Papacharissi, and this is the, whatever it is, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 quote on here, right? News producage practices in an age of mobile media locate humans at the center. So there's that word location, context. The center of journalistically informed storytelling, and are driven by customizing and repurposing of information. Technologies that afford mobility emphasize a user's location. So the fact that we can be mobile means that location becomes important or emphasizes it, but also afford a quote-unquote sense of place, which, quote, helps to conceptualize individuals' physical, psychological, and or social connections to particular geographic territory without necessarily locating them within physical spaces. So this is kind of an interesting scenario, and I think Papacharissi is much more optimistic about these things, right? In the sense that she is arguing that, like, I can feel a connection, a sense of place about Paris, even though I'm here in Brooklyn. One might argue very conversely that connection, that sense of place, since it is so dislocated, right, is not as interactive, effectual, contextualized, right? Do I think I really know what it means to spend a day in Paris, live in Paris, work in Paris, whatever, or in the outskirts of Oklahoma, just because I've followed, I don't know, somebody's screencast? I think those are things that are interesting. And it isn't about poo-pooing the internet or anything like that. Again, it's thinking about the context with which we're in, and how mediation and how notions of identity and self and place are changed, right? So this brings me to my sort of third, and we're about halfway through the video here, bringing me to my third sort of section, where I'm talking about the digital paradox, or what I call the echo chamber. And this is where I'm going to outline sort of some of the ways in which this sort of the dream or the promise of digital democracy, as Finley puts it, sort of is, I think, has been frayed at the edges, to say the least, right? One thing to think about, Papacharissi continues her argument. She says, while the resulting, and this is the seventh quote. I'm sorry if I said seventh earlier. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, seventh quote here. While the resulting patterns of news sharing challenge our existing hierarchies of news production, consumption, and distribution, it is questionable whether people themselves consciously and constantly perceive themselves as producers within the context of their everyday normality. And this is crucial, right, to me, in the sense that what Papacharissi is saying is that as much as we might now be more involved, and I guess that's also something to interrogate and question, the quality of that involvement, as I just brought up a second ago, although we might be more involved in our current context, are we actually conscious of that fact? And it's important, just like I'm saying, are we actually that conscious of our context and how it shapes us and determines us, right? The idea here being that if we were more conscious of it, perhaps, the fact that our tweets do matter, and like I said, a part of the question is, do they matter? But maybe if we had a sense that our tweets do matter, that our social media posts, that our blah, blah do matter, and understood ourselves as producers, as much more effective than we think, then maybe we could be, or strive towards, a more so democratic society. So one of the ways in which, so that could be one way in which the sort of digital democracy has failed, in the sense that we take it for granted. We don't understand the power that we have through the internet. And perhaps that's due to a sense of it being so vast. right? So what this means is there's a sort of radical reconceptualization of the self, or what it demands is that through understanding the context of where we are and understanding how these digital means of production are shaping us, changing us, producing us, alienating us. So some of those digital paradoxes, if you will, one that might be the first one is this kind of lack of consciousness or awareness of one's producage, as Papacharissi would argue. And I think part of that lack of consciousness is that feeling of being so dislocated, right? Distracted, right? So for example, I mean, this is not a critique of anybody in particular, but I have noticed in my classrooms, and I don't really crack down on this. People are on their phones fairly often. People are on their computers. They're in multiple places at once, as am I a lot of the time. I mean, I'm working on a computer, I'm on the internet, I'm following something, I have a chat window open over here, right? We're very decontextualized, we're very dislocated, right? And that notion of distraction, not to mention that we're often distracted, right? Another thing is Malcolm Gladwell it talks about something called weak ties, and I'm not going to go into it, but that, yeah, we might have more relationships with more people, and maybe even relationships, online relationships, virtual relationships, or if you just want to call them relationships, fine, with people from around the world through the internet. But Malcolm Gladwell argues that these don't substantiate very strong ties, right? Because they are so beholden to the mediation of the sort of internet. And then we get to this notion of and I'm going to mispronounce this word, but I think Papacharissi means homophily or homophily, right, in her essay. If we look at the 8th quote on the thing, she writes, homophily frequently shapes information flows across and within platforms, meaning, what does that mean? Right? Meaning that like-minded actors tend to listen to like-minded others, frequently inducing what has been called an echo chamber effect. At the same time, these articulated opinion silos frequently permit the expression of underrepresented or marginalized points of view. So let me address two things here. First thing is that notion of the echo chamber, which I think is really interesting, is that the fact that we have access to a much wider diversity of information, or even experiences, if you will, if you want to call them that, on the internet or through in the new media, it doesn't mean that we actually go seek them out and then we actually follow things that aren't in our interest, or we're not exposed. We tend to, and this is what Papacharissi is referring on the first part of that quote, is that we tend to sort of stick to our own silos. Right, I'm going to follow the blogs, and I'm going to be friends with the people, and I'm going to, with the celebrity, I'm going to follow the celebrities. I'm going to research the things. I'm going to listen to the music. That I like, and that's understandable, of course, right? And then it's hard. It makes one wonder: is there a way in which people were more exposed to diverse information? I don't think so. I mean, prior to the sort of digital age, if you will. No, I think we are exposed more, but I think one of the problems is our ability to, I was going to say something like hibernate, or our ability to sort of narcissify, right? Narcissus, the mythological figure who fell in love with his own image in the river. We have not only expanded as our ability to explore much more diverse material, but what is expanded just as fast, and perhaps is even more exponential or even more damaging in the fact that it is more perhaps in our interest, is our ability to keep to our own interests and to create these very intense silos, right? I can put up a lot more walls, right, in more interesting ways. So this brings me to the second part of Papacharissi's quote, where she says that this doesn't necessarily mean, I mentioned this earlier, that it's all bad. The point isn't to poo-poo the internet, but the point is to think about, right, she says, at the same time, these articulated opinions frequently permit the expression of underrepresented or marginalized points of view. So at the same time, suddenly there's the ability for, take a movement like Black Lives Matter and the hashtag for Black Lives, which really started out of a Black Lives Matter, out of a hashtag, right? And it creates this silo where people can join that movement, if you will, or participate and engage and interact and become informed, become involved with that movement. And therefore, you have these marginalized points of view being represented, being shown, being on a much wider and vaster scale. So instead of just, your white male literature teacher, right, curating your reading list for your class, you now have exposure to spaces or places in which there's marginalized points of view, or those points of view that aren't normally represented in traditional formats, they're there. And I think that's a great point, an important point, and reminds us that the question is, though, do we engage those spaces, right? My question to me was, but are these marginalized points of view respected? Are they, in many cases, really, the Black Lives Matter movement is still pushing and fighting just to have that space, that voice, right? That's a really difficult thing. To what extent is the fact that those voices, if you will, are dislocated by the internet, make that more difficult? I'm not sure. That's an interesting question, right? And this brings me to a couple quotes, that were from the Keyword Archive. One came from Mike, right, brought in a Ralph Waldo Emerson quote, right? And so this is quote number 9. To be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else is the greatest accomplishment. I thought that quote, now thinking about, Emerson's talking about a totally different context. All right. I mean, he's talking about the education system. Maybe he's talking about the rise of pop culture that's taking place during his time, right? But here we're also talking about that echo. Now we can see how this quote applies to the echo chamber, right? To be yourself, but of course here we're talking about that notion of individual that's different. Not yourself in terms of sticking to all the things you like, but being yourself in this case is to seek out the things that challenge who you think you are. And this goes to the next quote, which is by the poet W.H. Auden from 1961. In our culture, a would-be poet must educate himself or herself. He or she may be in the position to go to a first-class school and university, right? This is like talking about what I was talking about earlier with Viet Thanh Nguyen's thing, right? But such places can only contribute to his poetic education by accident and not by design. This is where I thought it was interesting that this notion of accident and ideas as accidents, right? That somehow, when Dom and Max came, we produced that commercial. One of the things that Dom, I think, emphasized and mentioned was that so many ideas are happy accidents, right? Which is to say that, fine, I might be immersed or submersed, if you will, within a sort of system, right? Whether it's the system of television production or the system of education or whatever system it might be. But every now and again, cracks will appear in that system, right? Which is why I think we call them accidents, right? Because things didn't go the way they were supposed to go. Or we did something that we weren't supposed to do. And that thing's going to be exciting and alive, I think, or at least partially by the very fact that it's not part of the design, right? It's not part of the expected design of things. So in order to understand what the design is, so I can then understand how, it's like in order to break the rules, you got to know the rules, right? That cliche. In order to understand how my project or my creation or my productivity can be effective, it isn't just about overturning the whole design, but understanding how the design can be challenged, disrupted, right? Changed. All right. So this brings us to round that out, and this is what Monica brought up in the Keyword Archive, a quote from John Keating, The Dead Poets Society. I still haven't seen that movie, but It's probably a book as well. But the quote is, just when you, that's it. Just when you think you know something, you have to look at it in another way. Even though it may seem silly or wrong, you must try. So there's that point about that individuality and taking a look, breaking out of the design. But you need to understand the design in order to do that. All right. Okay. So this brings us to this notion of affectivity. And this is something that, forgive me for a second, I'm going to bring up the quote from Papacharissi, right? She brings up this notion of affective practice, right? So this is the quote. It's not on the sheet, but I'm just going to read it. Affective news streams blend fact, opinion, and sentiment to the point where discerning one from the other is difficult, and doing so misses the point. The point isn't to figure out what is fake news or true news, right? Truth is fake news. Right. If we understand affective news streams not just as informative, but as collectively generated pluralistic arguments on what should be news and how news stories should be told, we may interpret affective news gestures as indicative of political statements of dissent with mainstream news culture and the agendas that culture cultivates. So her point there, I think, is profound for me, which is to say that the point isn't to discern what's true and what's not true. The point is the way in which the design of our news and our journalism is being disrupted by our new context, our new media context, is in itself by the fact that it is a kind of challenge to the design, to the system, in the way that it is happening, or the way that news normally happens, as she calls it, the traditional notion of journalism, is itself is something that we shouldn't just read as fake or true, right? That simplistic lens, but it's something that we should, right, as she says, that misses the point. We should think about it as an argument for how things could be different or how things could be otherwise. And for me, that gets at what we can do creatively and productively as a way to reach a different kind of truth, right? And so affectivity is really interesting in that way. And Auden, I think, gets at this, right? Again, going back to the sheet, right, in this quote, society is always to be aware of the utopias being planned by artists manqués over cafeteria tables late at night. In other words, society needs to the affective producers, right? But we got to see it. We got to understand our role as producers. We got to understand the context we're in, because we have an opportunity to change or resist that society. This is really interesting for me in terms of I've been following this and thinking about journalism just a little bit. I've been following this. I guess they're trying to come up with a new journalistic medium. It's this group called Des Correspondent. Again, I'm probably butchering the pronunciation, but anyways, you can sort of look it up online. They're doing all this research about what they're doing is spending time thinking about how news is changing and how can we create a new means of production of news that is more affective and interactive, right? So Emily Goligowski recently posted this article on the membership puzzle project, just thinking about how do we create this website, this scenario. And just quote, "We're less interested in the subscription scenario in which people give money and merely receive something like a magazine in their mailbox. That represents a benefit, but ultimately beneficial, but ultimately limited exchange. What we're fascinated by is robust interactions, right? This interactivity, direct contact between an organization's staff and its supporters that benefits the journalism itself. A notable example is Inside Story in Greece, which invites members to pitch ideas for investigations and then invites 3 members with winning ideas to co-report and publish with their editorial team. The resulting stories offer new knowledge that didn't previously exist for reporters or for other readers, and these are the types of rich engagements that we're eager to explore and share." So this whole idea of the readers, and we talked about this crowdsourcing in relation when Stephanie came, we're talking about it, and also in relation to what Max and Dom are doing, responding to what the audiences want. And then also allowing the audiences to be producers, to become involved, to become interactive. So that's something that I think is really intriguing. right? So rather than Trump, Trump, I feel like is trying so hard to control the media in its highly affective scenario, where it's hard to know what's true, what's not true, what's right. He wants to control what the media is saying about him and his presidency and all those things. And as Papacharissi says, that misses the point, right? I mean, Trump's interested in his own legacy, of course, and his own power. I mean, that's his interest. His interest isn't necessarily in finding a way to, I don't want to get too involved in the political arena of things, but I don't think his interest is primarily in figuring out a way to make our society more democratic. Right, so his fears of the media and the way in which, in some ways, his fear about the true and false is actually more a fear about the way in which the media is not something that can be controlled. It is of the people, and it is hopefully the media. I wouldn't say the media is of the people in our society. There are sources which make it so, but it is a threat, right? And it's, in the best sense, it is a threat. Which brings me to the sort of last category here, which is called sort of digital fallout, but also how to move forward, right? So for me, there's always been this sort of looming paradox. I mean, if you didn't notice right from the get-go in talking about these things, and it goes right to the third to last. I skipped over the Nietzsche quote. Right, Nietzsche makes this argument that we have art in order that we may not perish from truth, right? Which sort of goes back to that idea of what I was talking about in terms of it's not about what's true or what's false, right? That's not the way to think about things. Art allows us, brings in that affectivity, brings in that interactivity, brings an alternative viewpoint upon the current design or ideology that we tend to be following, right? Art takes into consideration the context within which it's operating and tries to get its viewer involved, right? So I always appreciate that quote from Nietzsche, right? We have art in order that we may not perish from truth. That it isn't about true or false. It's about different perspectives. Not just the perspective of the ruling class or those who rule the means or dominate the means of production, but also the perspectives of those who are marginalized, oppressed, silenced. So digital fallout and moving forward, one big paradox of this for me is that third to last quote. And Walter Benjamin, in his essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction or Reproducibility in 1935, right, he's thinking a lot about the rise of fascism, right? And the point isn't necessarily about fascism, but about how the ruling class and how the people can be subjected and silenced. He says, quote, "Fascism sees its salvation in giving the masses not their right, but instead a chance to express themselves. The masses have a right to change property relations. Fascism seeks to give them an expression while preserving property. The logical result of fascism is the introduction of aesthetics into political life." Now, this is a major paradox for me. So as much as I think as exciting as Papacharissi's point is about effective practice, right, I don't know that it's necessarily enough, right, in the sense that what Benjamin's saying is that if you give the people the ability just to say whatever they want to say, I think of the band like Rage Against the Machine, right? Rage Against the Machine had all these and so many other bands and so many other artists and so many musicians and so many people online have anti-establishment, anti-whatever, anti-president, anti-all, have activist ideas and are able to express them. But one of the ways in which powerful regimes, or one of the ways in which those ideas, by sometimes expressing them, feels like enough, right? And that's a way in which you pacify the people. Give them the opportunity to just say it. You might not like it, what they're saying, but that'll pacify them. Oh, I have freedom of speech. I'm good. Right? So fascism is the introduction of aesthetics into political life. You make political activity and political living and political and value style, There's that problem of individuality in the original conception that we were talking about in our first module. If you keep individuality as style, political living, those things, then we all are just out there spitting how different we are at each other. And we don't really think about our context, our place, our location, our history as a way to think about how we can engage society in a much more and more complex individualistic way, or to let our individuality come through. So something like Rage Against the Machine, they're signed to Capitol Records. I mean, go ahead. Say how much you hate society. Take something like Napster or LimeWire or Demonoid, right? These torrent sites, much more threatening, I think. Much more against the machine, if you will, in the sense that they attack, or they attack maybe the wrong, or like WikiLeaks. What they do is they are messing with and giving a different vision of the design and structure of our current digital context in our society. Right? Napster, I know Napster is old school and it's not even around anymore, or maybe it is. And we talked a little bit about the dark web or the Silk Road. Right? These things are hackers, right? They threaten the very sort of means of production. Rage Against the Machine is not threatening how records get made and made money. Napster, whatever, Demonoid, I mean, it's threatening films and all those things, the traditional design of how all that stuff, and this is sort of interest, I would imagine, to Chase and his project, is threatening the way all those things go down, the way those things happen. And I think that's where you can start to view a sense of a different kind of aesthetics, a different kind of affectivity, all right? And that brings me to two final quotes, and then we'll shut this down. Kind of two very strangely different quotes, but I think they get at what I was trying to set up at the start, right? First one is by Wayne Gretzky, who says, "I skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it has been." And the second one is by Adorno, and it's also been reiterated by Cornel West, a great contemporary theorist. "The condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak." And it's sort of getting at what I was talking about before. One's individuality is, to my mind, more not only linked to their identity, but it is also linked to understanding the way the context of their own society and the context of their history, of how one's people and peers and one's culture and one's society has determined the means of production, or used the means of production to determine people. Right? How do I create a new voice, not just in what I say, but how I do it, how I say it? And in order to do that, I have to think about the context of my society. So Gretzky's quote, right? So in order to allow truth, that's a more interesting notion of truth. A truth is a truth that speaks not only in terms of its content about the suffering that goes on, but speaks about that suffering by a challenge to the ways in which that suffering is enacted in the means of production. That is to say, the more truthful thing is the thing that not only brings a hard truth to the surface, brings a voice, or brings a truth to the surface that is normally silenced, but it does so by pointing out and subverting the machinations or the means by which that silencing occurred. And so Gretzky's quote for me is that. He's thinking, okay, how does hockey work? What's the design of hockey? Seems like a lot of players, the way a lot of people have played is to chase the puck. Well, I'm going to think about where the puck is going, or where it will be. And I might be wrong half the time. I might skate to some place and the puck never shows up there. Right? But sometimes I'm going to be right. Right? So thinking about the machines, the means, the way the game works, the design of the game, and thinking about how to therefore using that knowledge of that design, of that history, as a way to subvert it, change, and challenge it. All right, guys, I think that's plenty. Again, we're at about an hour. A couple things in terms of coming up and looking ahead real quick. Our project journal post 3 is due by the end of tonight. It takes me a while to change, upload these videos, but so the end of tonight, which is Friday night, our third project journal post. We have one more after this. Also, I'm really looking forward to the project presentations on Tuesday. I think it's going to be a great day. Again, like I said, it's a moment in which we can all collaborate again and develop our, continue to build our projects and develop our ideas in larger conversation with the entire class, right? Also note that we are also going to have a sort of discussion board, a post and reply about those presentations, and those assignments will be up shortly. As a way to sort of, again, continue the conversation, the collaboration, even after we do the project presentations in our paired groups. So those assignments will be up soon. Thanks for listening. I hope you made it this far. If not, no worries. But I'll see you on Tuesday. And thanks again to all of you for a wonderful, wonderful class, multiple classes, and just great ideas and activities online. All right, take care.